You're watching Canadian Muslim News on Muslim Network TV from Toronto, Ontario. This is Samia Sayed. Welcome to the show. Joining us shortly is Dr. Afua Cooper on having the Canadian government apologize for its history of slavery. But first, let's take a look at the headlines. Indigenous leaders advise Senate on truth and reconciliation. University of Waterloo to hold a silent vigil for former student. Toronto Raptors honor Afzaal family. Iran death toll tops 75 as protests intensify. And now the details. 5 Indigenous leaders have met with the Senate's Indigenous Peoples Committee ahead of Canada's National Day for Truth and Reconciliation to advise on events to take place that day. The committee is analyzing the federal government's responsibilities to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Dr. Megan Beals, a physician from Prince Edward Island, says to a media source she wants Truth and Reconciliation Day to resemble Remembrance Day. Beals says a moment of silence in remembering past events in communities across Canada is a fitting way to celebrate the contributions made by Indigenous peoples. University of Waterloo's President Vivek Goel has announced a silent vigil today for Sara Inam, a former university student killed by intimate partner violence in Pakistan. The vigil is to raise awareness about gender-based violence in different parts of the world, including Canada. Last week, the university held a silent protest in honor of Mahsa Amini, a 22-year-old killed by the Iranian Guidance Patrol. Goel says that Waterloo University will take part in the UN's 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence campaign. It is an annual international campaign that starts on November 25th, the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, and runs till Human Rights Day on December 10th. Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment, or MLSE, and the Toronto Raptors have worked with the City of London, Ontario to upgrade 2 basketball courts there, reports a media source. The courts were unveiled on Saturday morning to honor the Afzaal family, who were killed in an Islamophobic attack in June 2021. London's Muslim community and local youth were consulted in choosing the location and organizing Saturday's celebrations. The managing director of the MLSE Foundation says she hopes that the courts will serve as a reminder that hate has no home. The MLSE Foundation donated $250,000 to the City of London 1 year ago for the project. More than 75 people have been killed in the Iranian authorities' crackdown against unrest sparked by the death of Kurdish woman Mahsa Amini, says a rights group. The Iranian authorities' official death toll remains at 41, including several members of the security forces. The 22-year-old Amini died on September 16 following her arrest for allegedly breaching the country's strict rules on hijab and modest clothing. Tensions with Western powers continue to grow as France issued its, quote, strongest condemnation over the violent repression by security forces. Germany has summoned the Iranian ambassador, and Canada has announced sanctions on Iran. The European Union has deplored the crackdown, and Tehran called in the British and Norwegian envoy. And that's it for the news. Now, a few weeks ago, many Canadians renewed their calls for Canada to apologize for the history of slavery. Among these Canadians is Dr. Afua Cooper, a professor at Dalhousie University. She's joining us now to share more details on the topic. Welcome, Dr. Cooper, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Dr. Cooper, I mentioned that the apology is for the history of slavery in Canada, but can you give us a more detailed picture? What exactly did Canada do to Black people that would warrant an apology now?
The dominant experience for African Canadians during the 18th, 19th century was that of slavery. And then after the enslavement period, the period of segregation was ushered in. Segregation, racial discrimination. So when I say segregation, I mean Black children were forced into segregated schools or no schools at all. every aspect of Black life within this country, literally from the womb to the tomb, was segregated. And that meant that Black people had fewer economic opportunities, fewer social opportunities. They were discriminated against in every aspect of life. So you had slavery, then you had racial discrimination. So for some people, ironically, they literally had to leave this country and go to the United States to have an opportunity in life because America had a parallel Black civilization with Black institutions. So we are looking at the period of slavery and then the legacies of slavery, in which a severe anti-Black racism was ushered in, as I said, during the post-slavery period. But I'm also, people who are calling for an apology are also using the United Nations report as ammunition, if I may use that word. In 2017, the United Nations sent a working group to Canada to examine the state of Black Canada. And the United Nations working group points to some of the roots of anti-Black racism today as originating in the enslavement of African Canadians and the ensuing segregation, which I just pointed to. And so one of the recommendations from this working group is that the government, the federal government, apologize for slavery and make amends in various ways, if we may use the word reparations. So we have the weight of the top body in the world saying this should happen.
And how long has this call for an apology been in the works?
This call for an apology has been in the works for decades. 2017, the United Nations said yes, but people like myself and other people across this country for decades have been calling for an apology. It's nothing new. It's gaining more traction right now, but I would say at least 50 years.
Why is it taking so long to come to fruition then?
For one, because governments and many institutions simply do not want to empathize with Black people. They fail to see Black humanity. Within the psyche of Westerners, there's this profound anti-Blackness which came out of the slave trade. In fact, they were able to create this fiction called race to justify the slave trade. And when the slave trade and slavery itself ended within Western societies, what did they do? The British government did this. They compensated the slave owners and the enslaved people who were deemed as property. Now, if you're property, you're chattel, you're not a human being. But the enslaved people received not 1 cent from the British government. They paid the slaveholders for the loss of their property to the tune of 47 million pounds in 1834. And for the formerly enslaved people, they said, go along, do your thing, ha 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 ha, knowing that the life that they would live after slavery would be severely circumscribed because they did not receive any assistance. So it's this inability to empathize with Black people, to see Black humanity, to say you're free and that's enough, you're breathing the air, that's enough, go away and don't disturb us.
Now, you certainly mentioned that there is no indication whether there will be an apology, but what response have you gotten from the government? I mean, you said this call has been out for 30 years at least. How has the government reacted so far, other than not apologizing?
Well, they haven't apologized. That is their reaction. We thought when a body like the United Nations would issue such a statement, there would be some movement, but there hasn't been. But I must say, at certain levels, like at the provincial level, for example, there have been some apologies, not for slavery, but for discrimination. So with the destruction of Africville, the province of Nova Scotia apologized for that. They also apologized for the bad treatment that Viola Desmond received. And in July of this year, 2022, the federal government apologized for the treatment that the Black men who were in the Black Battalion, that unit in World War I, the Canadian Black Battalion, the Prime Minister apologized to I guess, posthumously, and to the descendants of the men of the Black Battalion for the bad treatment the racist treatment they received in Canada and in Europe. So there are some apologies for specific situations at the federal and provincial level, but so far none for slavery.
Mm-hmm. Now, from what I understand, there is also a group of people who say that there is no apology needed. What is the reasoning behind that?
The reason is, Saba, sorry, Samia, is again the inability to empathize with Black people. Black people are seen as unworthy. I've been doing this work for decades now, and that's my conclusion, and it's based in my research, this unwillingness to see Black pain and also to see Black trauma. So they will say, oh, no apologies given because X, Y, and Z, when my ancestors came here, nobody apologized to them, which is not true, because when in Stephen Harper's first premiership, something like 17 groups were singled out and apologized to for various treatments in World War I and in World War II. The Black community was not on the list, and still is not on the list.
Now, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier. You said in 2017, the UN's report included a bunch of recommendations for reparations, if you can call it that. What are some of those recommendations?
I have them right here. 1, apologize for slavery and consider reparations for historical injustices. 2, discontinue the practice of street checks or racial profiling with regards to criminal justice and policing. 3, address anti-Black racism in the criminal justice system. 4, collect data that is disaggregated by race, color, ethnic background, and national origins. Create a national Department of African Canadian Affairs to represent the interests of African Canadians. And the federal government has yet to respond to the UN Working Group's recommendation. These were made in 2017.
And among these calls, there seemed to be a need to create more awareness in Canada on anti-Black racism and more engagement from the people, from the government. Where does this begin and how does it happen?
Well, you see, it begins with, and I have seen some movement. I have seen at the federal level the funding being procured for small businesses and for Black businesses, something like, I think, $50 million to $100 million. So because it's recognized that, Black entrepreneurs face a special burden in terms of getting grants and in terms of getting bank loans. So there is some movement. There is some movement there. There's also some movement from civil society. There's some movement from various institutions like, the universities, from the banks. Even this morning, I was watching the news, and the Canadian Real Estate Association did this investigation on anti-Black racism within real estate. So civil society seems to be taking it more seriously than the federal government. But the federal government is important. The federal government is the lawmaker. Federal government is the one that's, that's responsible for all of us and has the responsibility to make sure that every Canadian is treated in the same way and none is put above the other.
And that's very well said. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Cooper. It was a pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you, Samia. My pleasure.
You are watching Canadian Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. That's it from our Toronto studios tonight. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more Canadian Muslim content. Stay safe, and until next time.